Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am here this evening to present Sarah Stewart Taylor with her new book, The Mountains Wild, which is right here on my bookshelf. She is joined in conversation this evening by fellow thriller mystery police novel author Archer Mayer. They know each other from old, so it is nice to have these two friends join us this evening as they are here to discuss Sarah's new book. I will mention that the book is available from Gibson's Bookstore, so I will be dropping a link into the chat box, and it is available before, during, and after this event. Good evening, Sarah. Good evening, Archer. Thank you for joining us here this evening.
Well, entirely my honor and my privilege. I'm here, as I told everyone privately before we went live, that I am Sarah's, biggest shill in this news, and she never, actually, she did send me a check, but it bounced, and but I'm still here, so that says volumes. It has fallen to me rather happily to be the sort of, I don't know if I'd call it master ceremonies, but the interviewer of note. And I just wanted, therefore, to break the ice by saying that The Mountains Wild was terrific. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And this is not just because our styles are somewhat similar in that we embrace geography as a character, but it was also wonderfully, but not overly convoluted. Character development played a big role. It was as much a how do it as a whodunit, and whodunits can be dreadfully boring. This passed muster on all venues, and I congratulate you, Sarah, for a job nicely done.
Oh, well, Archer, coming from you, that means so much. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Now, I'd like to continue, if I might. I know this is what I'm here for, but I always hate hogging the conversation, so I'm going to have to get over that. And some of this you've heard before, so you're just going to have to live up with that, because we are, after all, introducing newcomers to what you've been up to in The Mountains Wild. But there are a couple of interesting things going on, not the least of which is being that you've created a new character. This is the coming out party, if you will, of Maggie D'arcy, a Long Island-based police officer, which of course is close to my heart, who travels to Ireland on a bit of a quirky mission. I wasn't entirely sure if she took leave or went on vacation. So because cops, when they run away from home, they have to sort of rationalize it to their bosses. So that part I never quite grasped. But off she goes to Ireland, where of course you cut your teeth as a young lassie 3 years ago. And in this context, old for D'arcy and old for you, familiar to you, you nevertheless went out there, and I guess you did a lot of research and a lot of visiting these places, and it's the sense of place that impressed me the most. So if you wouldn't mind painting a little of that geographical aspect in, might I ask you to sort of fill us in on the choice of geography, not just in terms of country, but Dublin, and your decision to leave the city and go off in various directions to visit these truly magical little country venues, if you will.
Interesting. Okay. So yeah, I mean, as you said, setting it's something that I look for in mystery novels, and I find that the crime novels that I most love to read are often ones that really embrace that sense of either of an international or a foreign setting. I love books that are set in other countries, where you sort of learn a little bit about another place, you learn about the history of another place. Or, I think books like yours, where just the setting becomes a recurring character in the book, where you return to sort of beloved places in each book in the series. And so as I was as I was thinking about this book, right from the beginning, it had to be set in Ireland, and it had to be set in Dublin, because it was inspired, although inspired is a terrible word for something so tragic, but it sort of had its beginnings in a series of actual disappearances in Ireland, around Dublin and Wicklow. So I was sort of, I think I was sort of using that source material, but then creating an entirely fictional version of it in order to say what I wanted to say about these characters, and in order to create completely fictional characters who could kind of, be my mouthpieces for some themes that I wanted to talk about. So as you say, I had to do a lot of research because I lived in Ireland in the mid 1990s, and one part of the book unfolds in 1993, and a lot of the settings for that part of the book were sort of in my memory, and I wrote a first draft of the book just using my memory, I think. But the second part of the book unfolds in the two portions are sort of threaded together, but it unfolds in 2016. And Ireland has gone through a lot of changes, like many places, but in some ways, I think even more than many other countries, largely due to the Celtic Tiger and the sort of becoming an international financial center in the ensuing years. So I, over the last 8-9 years, have made quite a few trips back to spend time there and do research. And I know it was very difficult, but someone had to do it. And
that's the pain of being a writer.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of sacrifice, very hard work. But it was so much fun to kind of reacquaint myself and to do it with this purpose, of tracking down locations for Maggie to have these adventures. And when I look back on the writing of this book, I think that's the thing that I'll remember is these trips.
The challenging part to some of this, I'm going to interrupt occasionally because I forget what I'm thinking if I don't, so pardon my rudeness. But as you go into something, especially that is researched overseas, so you can't, since I work and live and write about Vermont, if I missed something, if I kind of went, but I researched it, but I don't want to use it, I want to use something else. I just get on my motorcycle, I ride over there, I take a look at it, I go, oh, it's green and not blue, and I go back and I put in, that. You're stuck.
Yes.
Yeah. So did you over-research? Did you ever find yourself in that particular pickle where you thought really fairly carefully that you were going to do something that you ended up not doing? And did you ever end up in sort of blind alleys?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question, actually, because I think that you think of writers as sort of having a plot, and then they do their research in order to write that plot. And in fact, we all know that it's never that direct or linear, right? That there's a lot of back and forth, and sometimes you think you can do something, but then you talk to your friend in law enforcement and they say, you could never do that, and you have to go back and change the plot a little bit. And I actually, in some early versions of this book, I had the spot where Maggie's cousin Erin disappears. Erin's disappearance is sort of the catalyst for the whole thing. And I had her disappear in one place and did a ton of research on one trip of that place. And then realized that for a variety of reasons, it just wasn't going to work. And unfortunately, I didn't realize this until I was home. But luckily, I had driven through another mountains, and I had I'd taken some pictures just in a more touristy way than in a researchy way. And I was able to go and look at my photographs, and I did some research and, spoke to some friends who had spent time there. And I was sort of able to switch because I had taken this sort of meandering drive through this other valley as well. Yeah. And I think that happens more than people know.
Oh, good Lord. Yes. No, I remember at one point taking at that point, I mean, she's dead at 99, but my mother was at that point in her mid 80s. And I remember sending her on a research trip because I really was running out of time. And I said, go over there and see if you can wade the river in this spot. And she was so enthusiastic, I thought she might actually try the damn thing. But did you have people to whom you could reach out to double check things in hindsight?
Yes. Yeah. I have some friends who live in Dublin who I was able to sort of say, hey, when you were a kid, did your family ever take a trip to this place? And what's your memory of it? Can you get food there? Can you, those little details that make a setting come alive,
Right. Right.
What's it like actually being there?
The other tricky thing that you do, of course, is you tell a story in 2 time zones, but I mean, not, here and there, but now and then.
Yeah.
So did you find yourself stumbling over making an example would be, if you really wanted to stretch that difference, you would make references to, oh, he sent a telegram to so-and-so versus picking up a phone. Well, this obviously wouldn't be that egregious, but were there considerations like that you had to wrestle with or dispose of because you couldn't wrestle with them?
Yeah, I mean, cell phones is the perfect example, right? So in 1993, when I lived in Ireland, and when Maggie first goes to Ireland looking for her beloved cousin Erin, who's disappeared, there were no cell phones. There were payphones, and you might have a landline in your rented flat, or you might not.
Yeah.
And it really, there was no email. There was certainly no Facebook, and it really changes how a criminal investigation proceeds when you have cell phone data and Facebook posts from the day before someone disappears and when you don't.
Yes.
And I actually loved juxtaposing those two experiences because it brought me back to that time in my life when I was traveling around Ireland and traveling around Europe, and I really, I just had to rely on myself in a lot of ways, and it's a really different thing.
Well, I bring it up pointedly because I think you did a good job, and I wanted to show you off a little along those lines. so nicely done, and you skirted that very, very elegantly. So congratulations. Now, of course, you touched on the policing before and after being significantly different. Both cases, of course, the agency, the Garda, was in place. Now, I'm presuming, perhaps overmuch, but it seems reasonable that just as you've done your stateside police research and contacts and references and advisors and whatnot, that you did the same thing over there. How complicated? I mean, I haven't never done overseas writing, so I have no idea what it's like to knock on the door of the Garda and say, you don't know me, but I want you to spill your guts about how you do everything. How did that go for you?
It was, it was hard to find some people to act as consultants, honestly. But I did, and it was, I knew that I needed to talk to members of the Garda, because it's a very different structure than American police departments, than state, town, or county police departments here. Ireland has a national police force. And within that, they have a Bureau of Criminal Investigation that takes on a lot of the roles that a county crime lab might take on, or in some ways that the FBI here would take on. And so it was just really important for me to kind of get those details of how, you know, a body is found somewhere, who shows up, who comes next, who secures the scene, what are the, you know, are those people wearing uniforms, who isn't wearing uniforms, you know, all those little details. And so I was very lucky to find some members of the Garda who were willing to kind of answer questions and help me with that.
Was there a sort of front office help of any nature? I mean, I remember going to the Chicago Police Department once, and they said, "Well, have fun with that," and the door slammed in my face. You know, and other places that say, "Oh, absolutely, we've got a PR place, and we'll assign you an officer." And they went over. You know, New York was great that way.
Yeah, it is interesting because I've had the same experience where some places are very willing to talk and some just aren't, and you wonder, you know, did they have a bad experience with some mystery writer who, you know, wrote a really negative cop character or something.
Oh yeah.
But they were, no, for the most part, they were great, and I was able to do quite a lot of research. You know, little things like following them on Facebook, you know, and following their Twitter account. And it's amazing, but it really gives you a sense of kind of the day-to-day, you know, kind of the day-to-day attitudes and feelings of law enforcement professionals towards the people they police. And yeah, so that helped a lot too. And I read books, but I think it was the actual people who I spoke to who were the most helpful.
One of whom you created in the form of Rolly.
Yeah.
I hope I've got the shortening Roland, but so I made it Rolly. Is that correct, Rolly?
Yeah, that's how I say it.
Okay, that's good. You just say Irish, and I have never met, so. But Rolly's a lovely character, and of course he spans both worlds. He goes back to the 90s, and he, albeit somewhat precariously, occupies the 1916, since he's a little bit on a leash as we meet him in that latter guise. He has, as usual, stepped on somebody's toe.
Yeah.
But, shall we say? Yeah. Anyhow, in that. Was that based on anyone, or did you combine several people, or?
Rolly was an example of a character who he started out just being a very tiny walk-on part. You know, I needed a cop for Maggie to report her cousin's disappearance to. And so I kind of started writing him, and I had this idea of a young cop who was, was always, I just had the sense of his physicality as being like always in motion. You know, this guy who was just high energy, like twinkling all the time, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I kind of I just wrote him in the scene where she goes to the Garda station and reports her cousin missing. And I couldn't leave him behind, you know. I liked him, and I wanted to keep bringing him back. And so he sort of took on a bigger role in the book. And then I started to, once I knew that I wanted it to unfold in 2 time periods, I sort of thought, what if he is still there 23 years later?
Sure.
And then it allowed me to ask all these questions about, well, what's he doing? How has his career progressed in those 23 years? You know, what's going on in his personal life? So yeah, that's sort of that's where Rolly came from.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Now, I have to be careful here because I don't want to give anything away, but you also do an extraordinarily good job of layering familiar relations. I mean, in one way, it's I say this supportively and encouragingly. It's a complicated book, but it's handled smoothly so that you educate the reader as you break the news to them about this character and that character and whatnot. And of course, not only that, but not only do we meet. I have a cat over here. Sorry about that. Not only do we meet Rolly, but of course we get to see Connor.
Yeah.
And given that you've got these family members, Aaron being obviously paramount among them, and Brian, and others. What were you thinking in terms of the character of Connor? What was his job to be in your mind's eye?
Good question. It's a great question, actually. So he, I think initially he was a complication. He was, I was trying to create all these questions about Erin's life and who was she and who was she really and what, where did she go? There's they have no sense of where she went. And so as the young Maggie, who's not yet a cop, but sort of has a cop's mind, is trying to answer that question, she goes and interviews all the people in Erin's life. And Connor, her coworker, is a little suspicious. There are things that he's not very forthcoming about. And Maggie gets a sense that there's more to the relationship between Connor and Erin than Connor is willing to admit. And so initially he's a suspect, but very, very inconveniently, she finds herself incredibly drawn to him too. And they have this connection that she can't, that she has never really felt with anyone before and she can't deny. And so, so he's a big old complication.
Yeah. As is, of course, the Catholic Church, which is another very Irish entity. And again, I congratulate you on bringing in something that is so integral to Ireland, and you made it into part of the plot, and it's quite well handled. I don't know what your religious background is, but did you have to do a lot of research into the Irish Catholic Church versus what we might all know just walking down the street?
Yeah, so I was actually raised Unitarian, so I was not raised in the Catholic Church, but I grew up in a very sort of Irish American, Italian American town, and so I was lucky enough to, when I'd be sleeping over at a friend's house, often I would go along on Sunday morning to St. Pat's or on Saturday night or whenever they were going to mass, and I remember being really fascinated by the Catholic Church. I loved the ritual and there was something about it that was really interesting to me. And so I think when I was living in Ireland, it was really, really interesting to me how the Irish Catholic Church was both a huge part of my friends' lives and becoming, during those years, less and less a part of their lives. And my friends had very very complicated relationships with the church, and a love of their heritage in the church, and a lot of questions about it as well. And I think that time in the 90s was a really interesting time to be sort of watching that.
Did you end up interviewing any Catholic priests? Because you do get into sort of the head of one. And
a great question. I didn't for this book, although the Catholic priest in the book is very loosely based on a priest who I knew a little bit growing up, through friends who were in this youth group at the church, and so yeah. But I did not actually interview any Catholic priests specifically for that plot line.
Yeah. All right, I have a sort of a trick question for you. In that, again, going back to our shared provenance, you and I, with using geography and whatnot, I don't want to become obsessional about geography, but the question becomes backdrop or integral. So could this story happen anywhere?
No, this story could not. I think in this book, the setting is absolutely integral to it. I think when setting, it feels that much a part of the book, it has to, it sort of has to be.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I don't think I'd want to write a book that I could just take the plot and plop it down somewhere else, you know?
Oh yeah, no, I read a book. Of course, he's dead, so I can kick him around a little. And he was also died, you know, a zillionaire, so I can kick him even harder. And that was Robert Parker wrote a book, the name of which escapes me, in which his hero Spencer goes to Hollywood to solve a crime or to be beaten up or whatever, do manly things. And in order to evoke Hollywood or Los Angeles, Parker had, of course, Spencer was a fanatical runner, among other things, and he would have Spencer leave wherever he was sleeping, go out into the street and start his jog, which was probably, given that it was Spencer, 13 miles in 10 minutes. But it was so clear that Parker was using a map.
Yes. I've read books like that too. And where you feel like maybe the setting didn't come into it until like the final draft.
Right.
And
could have done it in Tucson. It was irrelevant.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. Now, okay, so you've created Maggie. You've created, I might even suggest you've dangled Connor in front of us. So obviously you have ambitions to go forward with this notion. At least I hope, selfishly, I hope you do. But so what about Ireland? Do you leave it? Do you go somewhere else? Do you, Maggie goes to Portugal.
Hey, that sounds good. I'd like to go do some research in Portugal, actually. So I've actually just finished the second book that stars Maggie, or I'm just finishing it up. Finished is a strong word for what I've got, but I'm finishing it up. And it's really hard because I can't say too much about this book without giving a lot away about the first book, as you know. But I will say that I will say that Maggie in this book, Maggie is fully deputized, and that's sort of how I've been thinking of her as I've been writing this book. That in the first book, she's in Ireland, and even in the sections where she has already become a police detective, she has no power in another country, and so she's constantly having to like get around the actual cops.
Yeah.
And in this second book, I'm really, really enjoying just like letting her run and giving her her powers.
Lovely. That's lovely. Now, I don't want to be indiscreet. Same locale. In other words, is she deputized where, or
I
won't disclose? Okay, that's good.
I'm going to leave that. I think I'm going to leave that until more people have read the first book, because even telling you where she's working,
that's very sneaky.
Tells you something important. Yeah.
Okay, good for you. Good Lord. No, that's very amusing. Okay. Sorry about that. Should check my notes ahead of time. There are all sorts of questions I had. Yes. The character, and I'm sort of sorry to say this, but Lily, who is the daughter of Maggie, I forgot about her, and I'm one. So will she loom in the future? I like you, I've come up with characters and they stuck with me for book after book after book. Other characters, even though they're fully realized, I dispose of them. I don't kill them. I just don't use them ever again. What's Lily's?
Well, Lily, I mean, it's interesting with Lily too, because of course she doesn't really appear very much in the first book. Because Maggie, so Maggie is the divorced mother of a teenage daughter named Lily. And when in the 2016 section, when she goes to Ireland, once new evidence is found in her cousin's case, she leaves Lily behind with Maggie's ex-husband. And so, there are phone calls and some texts, and Lily is very much on her mind as she's traveling. But I liked the sense that this in 15 years, Lily is 15 years old, and in 15 years, this is probably the first time that Maggie has gone on, it's not a vacation, but she's traveling by herself. And so I sort of liked that a little bit, and the push and pull of that. And she's thinking about Lily and worried about Lily, and yet she's kind of enjoying this experience. So, and in the second book, Lily is a much bigger character, I'll say.
Okay.
And I'm enjoying sort of exploring. I'm able to do this because I have 3 kids. I actually have a 15-year-old, but he's a boy. And then I have a boy who's almost 12, and then I have a girl who's 10. So she's not yet a teenager. So I feel like I can write a teenage girl character without getting myself into trouble. But in a couple of years, I'll have to be kind of careful.
They do, by the way, get to choose your nursing home. So you got to be careful.
That's right. A good thing to remember.
That's something I've been very wary of with my 2 kids. So they love me, and I make damn sure of it. The weaker I get, the more I count on that. So let's go to mechanics, if I'm not becoming too boring. You're a professional writer. This is what you do. It's what I do. And although people might walk by and see us doing the equivalent of sheetrocking a room, and so you sheetrock a room and you paint it, and it's a wall. No big deal. But you and I know exactly what goes into that.
Right.
You got to cover the studs, and then you got to put on the mud, and then I won't overdo the metaphor, but there's a lot of stuff that in the end, you hope never gets seen.
That's right.
The idea is, I guess it was John Gardner who said, you create a fictional dream with a novel, and you don't want to make the reader wake up.
Exactly.
Your job is to make them wonder, oh my God, I forgot to change the laundry 3 hours ago. It's all growing mildew, and it's because I was so trapped by this peerless prose. But getting to the peerless prose is a bear. What is your, this is going to be way too open-ended, but hey, this show is yours, so the burden's on you. What is your process? Let me be really greedy and go from beginning to end. Because it's your first D'arcy book, so, here you go. You literally had a blank slate.
Yeah. So I did have a blank slate, although I found that my process was very similar to what it's been for other books, which is that I am a big fan of a super rough first draft. I really feel the need to just sprint through the first draft to kind of get the shape of the story down on paper or on my computer screen. And it's almost like until I write the end on that really terrible first draft, I don't really know what the book's about, and that first draft is very much a sort of, a dream experience. It's just, I don't know where it's coming from. It's just kind of, flow is not the word I would use, because it's much more painful than that, getting the first draft down, but it just kind of, I vomited it out, shall we say.
Stream of consciousness of a febrile person.
Exactly. So yeah, and those first drafts are really terrible. I mean, they're just full of holes, and characters have one name on page 7 and a completely different name on page 10, or they don't even have a name. They're just, the woman who she bumps into on the street, or,
Yeah.
But it serves to show me the shape of the story and to kind of give me a sense what I'm on about. And then,
how long is that? How many pages, roughly?
Good question. Good. I actually would be really interested to hear how long your first drafts are. My first drafts are usually, so my mysteries are usually somewhere between, this one is 400, it's over 400 pages. This is a longer book probably than most that I will write. But say most of them are somewhere between 300 and 400 pages. My first draft is often like 150 pages. So I think some writers overwrite and then go down. I tend to underwrite and then expand. So I have to ask you, I'm sorry, but I have to ask, which are you?
Uh, Oddly, I'm neither. I write a book. I do a lot of research. I don't do any plotting. I don't do any outlining. I sit down and I write a book.
Oh, I hate you. How do you do that? How do you know what happens? How do you know what it's about?
I was in one of my previous lives an EMT and used to an advanced level in EMT. And we used to go out on ambulances back in my day. I did this for like 35 years, and among other odd, peculiar, and paradoxical jobs that I've had, this was one of them where I was actually helpful to people instead of nowadays pronouncing them dead. So I worked with a paramedic. Now, this was a true wild woman. I had to pick up and clean up after her because I was not a paramedic level. I was an advanced level, but she outranked me. So that means I get to clean up after her.
Yeah.
So we would go out on these just blood curdling calls, and the ambulance, she'd wander off, and the ambulance would be a disaster area, and I'd be putting everything back together, but never with any resentfulness, because it had been like watching the world's best concert pianist just sit down and knock off something spectacular. I mean, and I once asked her, I said, so how do you do that? Because we all have some level of wannabe when you're confronted with someone miraculous like that. And she looked at me and she said, oh, that's PFM. Well, now in the world of medicine, acronyms, initializations rule the world. You never know what anyone's talking about. And I kind of went, okay, what? And I will clean it up a little bit, what she translated it as, by saying pure frigging magic. I thought, oh, yeah. So it's just, I bummed around a lot. I did a lot of different things in my life, and I came to writing because I discovered my musical instrument, which are words, and the cadence, and the use of a phrase or a selection of words. The point being that fictional daydream of John Gardner should not just be entrancing and seducing, it should also be melodic and elegant and eloquent.
Yeah.
Much like a long, complicated, very smoothly written and rendered piece of music.
Yeah.
That's where the pure frigging magic introduces itself, and it's not something you got. It's just it's DNA. I come from generations of writers and scholars and academics, and I'm that lunatic fringe of old New England, which are the artists, scholars, scientists. That's my provenance, and they all valued the word. And so I guess that's what I got. I actually aspired to be a photographer, which is another form of storytelling, but I always recognized I'm not going to be that good.
Yeah. So that's so interesting to me, because for me, the sort of magic, to the extent that it exists, happens in like draft 3 or 4.
Yeah.
But I don't get there. I don't get to that place where I have that sense of like, okay, this is coming together, this is happening, until I do that earlier work of just like vomiting out the story and and then starting to shape it. So that's so interesting to me. And
so
I'm jealous.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say I'm jealous.
Well, I'm just hyper nerdy about this. So let me pursue a little bit more. And I know everyone else has either left or fallen asleep, but we'll get back to relevant stuff soon. But I'm just geeking out here. So you've done your 150-page draft. You've sort of got it. You're tearing things apart. You're more importantly putting things in, because obviously to any sort of carcass of a building, you need to add walls and windows and doors and all that stuff. And that's what you're doing as you expand it and expand it. Now, we just bragged about my system, which is to paraphrase Dashiell Hammett, I put my ass in a chair and I type. So, and I don't do all that stuff. But what I do, in fact, employ are my own private editors, and I've got a bunch of them. So once I finished that book and I edited that book multiple times, I'll then send it out to these people who are either paid or not paid, depending on the sliding, scale of how much they owe me. We won't bring up blackmail. The point of the exercise is for them to tell me, you screwed up. I didn't get that. I didn't like this. I'm missing this. You did this too much or this too little.
Yep.
And then I go back and I really pay attention. Now the volume doesn't change a whole hell of a lot, but its contents vis-a-vis the musicality of the prose, that's key. That's where all that change and polishing, to mix metaphors and go to woodworking, which I adore doing in my woodworking shop's much bigger than my office. That's where I sand and polish and smooth and apply the finish. How about you, babe? What do you do?
So there's definitely a point in the process where I do that, but for me it's later. I think I use the first 2 or 3 drafts to figure out the plot and to really pin my characters down. I think that's one of the big things that I'm doing in those early drafts is, I write a scene with a character like Rolly, and then I think, oh, I want to bring him back, and if I'm going to bring him back, then I need to understand who he is and what he's been doing, and like, what's the thing that really drives this guy, and what's his biggest fear. And so, I'm kind of doing all that characterization work in those drafts. And then, it's not that I don't think about the language then. Sometimes I'll write a line and I'll just really like it and know I want to keep it. But I love to print out a book.
Yes.
And like take a couple days off and then go sit in a different place than I usually sit and read it on paper. And that's where I say, oh, better line, or here's a metaphor I could add in, or
Yes.
So I see you nodding. Yeah.
I can only congratulate you on a perfect technique.
It's a good one, isn't it? Yeah.
Just so happens the one I practice. But now, do you employ outside editors or not? Your people, not the publisher. I don't care about them.
I have, yeah. I mean, I have friends and fellow writers who read, who I give books to read. And for this book, I actually hired an Irish editor because I really wanted the dialogue to be right, and I knew I needed someone who grew up in Ireland and had could do that for me. So and she was great. She offered other kinds of feedback as well that was really helpful. But it's interesting. I feel like writers are more and more doing that before it gets to I have a fantastic editor at Minotaur, Kelly Ragland, and she's great. And my agent is a great editor. So I very much trust them, but I've heard more and more writers sort of even hiring someone before they get it.
That's what I do. I've got 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. No, my New York publishers think I'm a hell of a good writer.
Right. It's like perfect by the time it gets to them.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly right. So I know Elizabeth has got her oar in the water. So what's up?
So I'm going to take this moment to remind people that the Sarah's book is available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we are happy to ship. We are happy to do curbside. We are happy for you to come into the store and pick it out yourself. But we actually have about 10 more minutes, and we have a couple audience questions. By the way, in the chat, they're loving your writer geekery going on right now. So Well done. So we have a couple questions here which are sort of similar. Someone asked, they're loving the background discussion. How much time did you spend doing the research before you started to write? And then someone asked, for writers who don't have the means to travel, do you think using YouTube to research a setting is acceptable, or are they doing readers a disservice?
Good. That's a great question. I want to talk about that a little bit in a second. So for me, research and writing it's very much a sort of back and forth thing. You know, it's like I write a little bit and figure out what research I need to do. I do the research, I write a little bit more, need to do a little more research. And, you know, and I suppose there's a certain amount of research that I do before starting a book, just to have, especially if it's sort of an issue book, you know, where you need to have researched a specific issue to write it. So I probably did a couple months of research before I started writing this book, and then I was doing some travel in there, and kind of back and forth. So I love the question about YouTube, and I would actually encourage you to use Google Street View as well. Google Street View is an incredible tool for writers when you can't travel somewhere. You can literally walk down a street in a place you've never been by using Google Street View. And it's not, you know, I think it depends on the book. I think if a book is, you know, so wholly of a place, you know, if there's any way you can travel there, you should, because you can get the smells and the sounds, and things will happen to you that you never could have imagined would happen in that place, you know. But if it's a place that maybe, you know, appears a few times, or you know, a place that there's no way you're going to be able to travel there, use Google Street View. It's incredible. It's so much fun. I've spent hours and hours and slowed down my entire family's internet by, you know, slowly walking down Irish motorways and turning to the left and turning to the right and looking at what's there. It's a great tool.
Me too.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Someone asks, will Maggie and Sweeney ever cross paths?
Oh, wow. That's quite a question. So for those who don't know, Sweeney is the main character of my prior series. And I have not, it's funny, I have never thought of doing that, but now I'm a little intrigued. I'll have to think about that and see if there might be a way they could cross paths. Interesting. Thank you for asking that.
And we have someone who asked, how did the both of you end up in Vermont?
Oh, why don't you go first, Archer?
Well, actually, funnily enough, being chronically unemployable and having had my last full-time with benefits job in 1978, before I walked away from the table and just became an independent contractor in everything I did, from law enforcement to EMS to across the board, I offer myself as a contract. So I wanted to be a writer. I began writing in 1975 novels, and discovered very quickly that alongside of my inbred incompetence was my interest in motivation of characters. So in order to do that, you need to have access to an environment where you can deconstruct the population and figure out why do people act the way they do and in various ways. Well, Vermont only has 12 people, so it seems a very reasonable place to move to, because one of them is going to be the governor and the other one's going to be living under a bridge. And you'll be able to walk up to either one, because even the governor doesn't have a house. He's on his own, so you just call him up. And it turned out, all farce aside, that's exactly what occurred. I was able to get into Vermont, meet a lot of people very quickly, ask them why they do what they do and how they do what they do, and always introducing myself as the most ignorant person in the room, and took notes. And as a result, I moved to Vermont to be a writer.
Yep.
And Sarah, how about you?
So I grew up on Long Island and went to school there, but my dad was from New Hampshire, right on the Vermont border, and in fact went to high school in Vermont. So I had, we would come up and see, my parents were both teachers, and we would come up and see my dad's family in the summer and spend a lot of the summer up here. And I went to college in Vermont, and I think I always had this, there's always this like funny New Hampshire Vermont rivalry, which we all know about. And so I lived in New Hampshire for a while, but then I met a guy from Vermont, and he lured me over. He lured me across the Connecticut River, and that's pretty much, that's how that goes.
That's how we do it over here.
That's right. That's right. They lure us across. So yeah, so here I am.
So we're just about at the end of our event, and I wondered if either of you have upcoming projects that you would like to talk about here at the end.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say that I am so excited about Archer's new book, which is coming out in September, and it's called The Orphan's Guilt, and it sounds fantastic. And for anyone who read Bomber's Moon, like me, you're ready for the next one. So put that on your calendar.
You're very kind, Sarah. I greatly appreciate it. And that is indeed entry number 31 in the Joe Gunther books. And I'm 2/3 way through entry number 32. So we're going forward.
Wow. Anything on the horizon for you, Sarah?
Well, this second Maggie D'arcy book that I'm finishing up will be out next year. So that's the next thing on the docket, I think, unless some project just pops into my head between now.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, the both of you, for joining us this evening. I will remind our audience that Gibson's Bookstore does have Sarah's books, The Mountains Wild, available for purchase. We do ship, and we hope to see you in our store soon. Sarah, I hope that we have you in the store for your next book. That would be nice. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Archer. Thank you, everybody, joining us from home. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Archer.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a privilege.
Thank you, Gibsons, too.